All right. Hello, everyone. We're back here at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, and a lot has happened since we came at you last, and we're gonna go through all of it. We're gonna do a little preview here of the incoming Trump administration, some key policy, some key personnel, some key issues, and we've got Zack Shapiro and Matt Pines joining us today. And so, yeah, we're gonna hammer through all of this. We're gonna move kind of quickly just so we make sure we get to everything. But yeah, thank you both for joining. Okay, so we're gonna start here with personnel today, and I think the big one on our list is Scott Bessent, who is our incoming Treasury Secretary. He still needs to be confirmed, but as far as the sort of Bitcoin community is concerned, I think he is our key player. So we're gonna go to Matt Pines here first. What are we looking at with Bessent? What's going to sort of go through his desk? And how is he going to be looking at this Bitcoin issue?
Yeah, I think it's important to step back and think about how does Bessent see his role in the incoming administration, and his public remarks about you know presiding over what he called a global economic reordering and even a monetary reset. So he's thinking of his role in pretty sort of historical and geopolitical terms, not as a traditional Treasury Secretary who's kind of ensuring that the debt ceiling issues get worked out, although that will be a pressing issue on his plate. He sees himself as like quarterback for Trump's larger geopolitical and economic agenda, and fundamentally sort of reshaping what, in their view, is like a structural imbalance to global trade that, to a certain extent, is downstream of the structure of the monetary system. And so they've also brought a number of individuals into the incoming administration. Steve Moran, who's the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, that shares this view of kind of a global economic restructuring that could be unilateral or multilateral. And so they're thinking in terms of a chessboard with non-traditional tools of statecraft, not just tariffs, not just sanctions, but both overt and covert kind of agreements and coercion of our friends, our allies, and our adversaries and our rivals to try to reset the terms of the global economic and monetary system. So that is like their context coming in. Like, they have big plans. They're very ambitious. We'll see if they can execute on those plans, but that is going to be like their overarching kind of policy orientation, especially in the first year, where they're going to try to get some of these big structural things move in the right direction. Bitcoin is sort of coming in from, I think, a policy conversation that is outside of that kind of core kind of geopolitical trade tariff discussion. But it is starting to integrate, although it's not clear right now how closely those things are fused together. That's why we wrote our white paper, Global Economic Reordering, directed at Secretary incoming Bessent. We got, maybe, I wouldn't say 100% confirmation, but pretty good confirmation that he's at least looked at the report. I don't know if he's read the whole thing, but he's aware of it. And certainly he's aware of President Trump and other Trump advisors' very specific focus on implementing pro-Bitcoin policies. And so he is, I think, amenable to that. I think he is, though, as part of his incoming, what's on his agenda, it's unclear how much of a priority Bitcoin will be, right? That remains to be seen. I think it will be coming from the top down. It'll be coming from other parts of the administration that he'll have to respond to. So he has made very positive statements about Bitcoin, very positive statements about the industry more generally. I think he's ideologically aligned. He certainly has also made very negative statements on CBDCs. So like all the vectors are aligned. But in terms of how he executes on policy and what are his policy priorities, given the ambitions that they have for this global economic reordering, I think the key policy objective for folks like us is to try to align pro-Bitcoin policy and a conceptual and analytic understanding of Bitcoin in a way that fits in with and supports that larger set of policy objectives, right? Not to say, hey, pay attention to Bitcoin because Bitcoin is a special thing that, needs to get attention. It's more, here's how Bitcoin and maybe the larger set of policies around around digital assets and stablecoins more generally can align with and support your overall policy objectives. And so that's, I think, one of the main kind of narrative and analytic objectives, at least that we have for the coming year.
Great. Zack, anything to add on the Bessent front?
No, I mean, I think, like Matt said, he seems aligned. We've yet to see what he'll say once he's in office. But I think he's going to be broadly supportive. I think, he's, to the extent that the administration wants to do an SBR by executive order, my expectation is he'll be supportive of that as well. And I'm particularly keen to see who's going to be in charge of some of the subparts of the Treasury Department, FinCEN, OFAC, other parts of Treasury that touch the work that we do.
And it's worth noting, Scott Bessent showed up to the inaugural crypto ball, and was doing the rounds. Lots of people taking pictures with him. So take that for what it's worth.
And disclose that he owns some Bitcoin.
Yes, I think it's less than 500,000 total in the ETF. I mean, he's worth $1 billion. So, but
right.
It's something.
Right. Right. It's something. And I think, the larger point here is, across the board, the sort of key personnel in the Trump admin are looking to sort of shake things up in this, economic reordering that Bessent has spoken about, in depth, is evidence of that. Some further evidence of that is a new role in the administration, which is the crypto and AI czar, David Sachs, who was also involved with the crypto inaugural ball. So going to go to Zack Shapiro here on that. What exactly is that role? And, if you want to get into how that sort of interfaces with Bessent as well, feel free. Thanks.
Yeah, so that's another thing that we have sort of yet to fully see fleshed out. From all the reporting, it seems like this is going to be, in some ways, an informal advisory role to the president. David Sachs is someone who's been around Silicon Valley for a long time. He's part of the PayPal mafia. He's sort of in the sort of Peter Thiel orbit, along with Elon Musk and other people that are become increasingly influential in Trump world. And my expectation is that this will be someone who is a trusted advisor to the president on issues relating to crypto and AI. There's sort of like a saying in DC that there are two types of power. There's direct power and there's influence. This, I think, is much more of a influence role than a direct power role. But that's not to minimize how important influence is, especially in an administration like the incoming administration that believes very strongly in executive power and the unified executive theory and intends to do a lot of things by executive order as opposed to necessarily by coalition building on Capitol Hill. So, I think David Sachs is likely to have a outsized influence on the way that Trump and, therefore the executive agencies think about and treat crypto issues. I think if you look at David Sachs's record, I think there's a lot to like there with regard to Bitcoin. David Sachs is someone who seems to have understood Bitcoin and Bitcoin's value quite early on. He's invested in several Bitcoin-specific startups, especially ones that are building on the Lightning Network. I think there is reason for optimism there about his support of the industry and of the infrastructure that's being built around Bitcoin.
Yeah, one additional comment on that is that role fuses crypto and AI, right? Which is an indicator of how the incoming administration views these two technologies, right? And they share certain sort of structural and sort of economic similarities, right? In terms of they're very energy sort of intensive, and they're going to potentially be even integrated in some business models as they look to develop high performance computing, different sorts of dynamic loads with Bitcoin miners and novel energy sources coming to market, and sort of the massive sort of grid build out. So those policies are very those policy implications between the industries are very similar. There's also the sense of geopolitical competition at play with both. That Trump wants the U.S. to dominate and win in both AI and crypto. He wants us to be kind of the leading nation in both of those. And so that's sort of one of the mandates for David Sachs. and they have kind of this sense of energy and acceleration behind them, right? That this is where there's a lot of attention and capital and innovation, and the rate of change is just faster than in many other industries, right? So you need to have someone who's a point person, a belly button to the industry. But on the other hand, like AI in particular is dominated by these massive personalities, like these huge, sort of mega egos with huge amounts of capital. And it's unclear to an extent, like David Sacks, who's a powerful person in his own right, can really, corral these individuals. And I would just note that I didn't see, he might have been in the background, but I didn't see David Sacks at that White House announcement the other day on the Stargate sort of investment, right? Which was like a signature initial AI big investment by obviously, Mahayashi and, like SoftBank and OpenAI and Oracle, which is a signature AI investment. I didn't see David Sacks around that dais. I don't know what that means. But if there's an indicator here of like, where's David Sacks' attention going to be, right? Is it going to be on the AI side or the crypto side? Just sort of my, reading the tea leaves is it might be tougher for him to like wield so much power on the AI side because of just how much existing, influence there already is with these massive companies, that he might just sort of gravitate to crypto where he can potentially have more influence. But that's just a speculation. And he comes from, I think he's very knowledgeable about the crypto industry. But I think he doesn't necessarily come from like a Bitcoin specific background. Right. So that will like be, interesting policy question as to how does he navigate the different dynamics within the industry that represent these different sort of stakeholder perspectives.
Yeah, I think symbolically having such a role as the crypto and AI czar and tying crypto and AI together in that way, I think there are two things that stand out to me. One is I think David Sacks is sort of meant to be a representative of what Mark Andreessen calls the little tech agenda, which is different than the massive investment funds, infrastructure companies, big tech companies that are involved in Project Stargate, which is really about creating a grid and sort of chip ecosystem to allow the United States to be a leader in AI. I think David Sacks is probably there more on the software side, right? Like what type of AI tools will be allowed to be developed? What kind of regulation will there be of frontier models? And this is something both the Biden administration and, for example, the state of California wanted to punitively regulate. And one of Mark Andreessen's big criticism of the Biden administration was depending on how you hear it, either an implicit or explicit threat to directly sort of regulate and capture the capabilities that models can have, and up to and including literally classifying linear algebra, the math that a lot of this AI stuff is based on. I think David Sacks is going to have a different orientation towards that. And so too, right? The last administration really tried to throttle crypto to keep it out of the financial system. Charitably, they were worried about contagion. Less charitably, but perhaps more realistically, they just didn't like the crypto industry. And there too, I think he's likely to take a different approach. And so this is sort of Silicon Valley, as the sort of startup world, as opposed to Silicon Valley of Apple, Google, Meta having a voice in the White House. The other thing that's interesting about putting these two sort of policy areas together into this role is it sends a strong signal about crypto. I think it is very easy for both policymakers and ordinary Americans to understand, at least directionally, how important AI is and where it is headed. I mean, it's hard to tell because we're all sort of in a bubble in the tech space. We probably are early adopters of AI relative to other folks, but I think people can see where things are going with automation and AI. I think it is less obvious to both policymakers and to ordinary people that digital assets are important and why they're important. And putting them together, I think, frankly, it raises the stature of digital asset policy by putting it sort of on a piece with AI as a critical area for the administration.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think the key takeaway here on the crypto AI czar is also the extent to which crypto policy is becoming sort of more complicated to a large extent. And I think the signal here and also the signal with Paul Atkins moving into the SEC is that there are a number of issues within the crypto space that, really have not gotten the clarity that maybe they deserve. So I want to dig into Paul Atkins, and we can go to Zack on this. But Zack, I also want you to sort of dig into, what are the concerns about the crypto industry, and how do those maybe overlap or not overlap with, sort of Bitcoin policy more specifically?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of concerns, regulatory concerns in the crypto industry. There's a lot of lack of clarity. And then in areas where there are things that look like clarity, there are cases where the rules are just not workable in their current form. So the biggest sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room for crypto is a question about what regulatory agencies have jurisdiction over, specifically both launches and secondary sales of crypto tokens. And the big question is, is X or Y token, when it gets launched, is that regulated by the SEC as a securities offering or the CFTC as the sale of a commodity? The reason why this is such a big issue and the reason why this is seen as existential for token issuers and exchanges is because it is existential. Under the current securities law, if your token, when it is bought or sold, constitutes a securities offering, you can't really do anything interesting in the crypto world with it. It can't really trade on DeFi. It needs to be on a regulated securities exchange. It's very hard to have non-accredited investors get access to it. It would be really bad for sort of the liquidity and functionality of crypto. So the SEC so far, under the Gensler administration at the SEC, has refused to provide any sort of guidance about where it thinks the line is, specifically under current law between being a security and a commodity. People who've come in and talked to them about that have found what they told the SEC used against them. The SEC has said, we're not your lawyer, we can't give guidance. And so, I think the biggest change we're likely to see under an Atkins SEC on that question is more engagement with the industry, less regulation by enforcement, more no action letters, more explicit guidance about here's how we think you can do a compliant token offering. And that will be a big improvement for the industry and probably lead to a lot of capital formation in the crypto space. However, it's not a fix of the underlying problem, which is that these securities laws are really not meant for permissionless digital assets. And that is something that would require a legislative fix. And so, one of the things we might see in this administration is a market structure bill passed through Congress. That's probably the sort of longer term fix to this question. But so number one is this securities versus commodities regulation question. The second, and that one really doesn't interact with Bitcoin so much. There are some Bitcoin-like products that have securities law concerns, but that's really a fringe thing in Bitcoin at this point. The other areas, I think, interact much more with Bitcoin specifically. So the second biggest regulatory question in the digital asset space is a conceptual question. This is less about the SEC, but there are some interactions with securities law regulation. It is where is the legal line between a peer-to-peer transaction that is just intermediated by software, right? Where someone interacts with someone else, whether they are sending money, whether they are trading assets one to the other, or any kind of other financial transaction, where it is regulated as if there are just two parties that are interacting on a peer-to-peer basis, and when is it regulated as if there is a financial intermediary? And sort of the big innovation of Bitcoin and crypto and blockchains is that there is now a way for individuals to interact with one another on a peer-to-peer basis, just intermediated by code, and there's no trusted third party. The Byzantine generals problem, the solution of the Byzantine generals problem by proof of work and now some other consensus mechanisms really allows for a transfer that looks like, paying someone else on Venmo. But unlike a Venmo transaction where you have correspondent banks sending assets from one to another on a complicated sort of chain of custody, the blockchain transactions are just direct. The version of this the SEC has to deal with is where is the line between a decentralized exchange that is just code and where is there a securities brokerage? There's a treasury version of this, which is, what types of tools that operate on the blockchain are subject to the Bank Secrecy Act. And so this is an area that is important both for crypto and for Bitcoin, and really involves all three branches of government. There are active criminal court cases about this that we've talked about a whole bunch in the Samurai Wallet and Tornado Cash case. This is something that could be solved by Congress in modernizing the Bank Secrecy Act yet again. I mean, it's been modernized a whole bunch of times, especially in the aftermath of 9/11 and then again in 2020. But the Bank Secrecy Act could be clarified by Congress, or different guidance from FinCEN specifically or the SEC and how it views this issue. But that's sort of the second big issue. And then there's a whole host of smaller things that I think impact both Bitcoin and crypto. One of the things I'm particularly looking for from the SEC is a definition of what the SEC thinks is a qualified custodian. So far, it's been very unclear what you need to be, and to be a qualified custodian, do you need to be a bank? Can you be a trust? Do you need a federal charter? And so far, the only institution that's gotten a federal charter and seems to have the blessing of the federal government to be a custodian is Anchorage Digital, which the government uses for its custody needs. But there are lots of businesses out there that want to be involved in the custody game, that want clarity. There are all sorts of sort of family offices and funds that need, just because of their governing documents, they need a qualified custodian, and it's super unclear what that means in crypto. And so that's definitely something the SEC can help with. And then there are other sort of small SEC related things. Right now, with the Bitcoin ETF, there's no in-kind creation or redemption, which makes it hard for people who are holding actual Bitcoin to get into or out of the ETF in a tax advantage way. If that changes, I would expect a lot more liquidity of Bitcoin to flow into the ETF, where you could issue financial instruments against that, et cetera. There are versions of this for the rest of crypto, right? Are they going to approve like a Solana or XRP or Doge ETF? There are rumors of all three. Are they going to allow a staked ETH ETF? Right now, the Ethereum ETFs have underperformed because if you're holding the ETF, you are losing out on the proof of stake emissions from Ethereum, which is just worse than going to a financial institution who will create a special purpose vehicle where they will stake your ETH and you will get that yield. So it's a great consequence to the ETH ecosystem, whether they allow staking in the ETF. So lots of questions for the SEC. Some of them, in fact, many of them probably impact Bitcoin in some way, except for that sort of biggest question of where is the line between a commodities sale and a securities offering.
All right, cool. Anything to add, Matt?
No, I think Zack covered it. I mean, there's a stablecoin piece that I think potentially has the most traction, right? At least, I don't know, Zack, you tell me if you agree with this, but it seems like, generally speaking, there's more consensus, although not perfect consensus, on what a type of regulatory framework looks like for that across the industry than necessarily for the market structure side of things. And so if if it looks like, I mean, the legislative calendar is going to be busy. There's going to be a lot of priorities people are going to try to get, through this Congress. And it seems like everyone's optimistic. Everyone's expecting, a lot of positive action. But I don't think it's yet to be worked out exactly like what's the rack and stack of the priority order. And in particular, right, where something like Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, like SentinelOne's Bitcoin Act, which has sort of come out a little bit of left field relative to those two existing legislative topics, will be kind of put onto the agenda. And if she's going to chair kind of digital asset subcommittee on the Senate side, she has agenda setting power in that role, and she's obviously made it very clear this is her top priority. So she'll be looking for co-sponsors on that side, not necessarily directly relevant to the SEC, but starts to butt up against other industry perspectives on what should be moved first. How much political capital is the new administration going to be willing to spend on these different initiatives? And that's going to be one of the things that I think, as BPI, we're going to be focused a lot on, both in terms of the policy analysis, the advocacy, as well as the engagement on the Hill. And that's very, very specific to Bitcoin. But that also means that a lot of other people, may not have a direct interest in it if it doesn't relate to their particular projects. And so, yeah, that's where it's also maybe one of the reasons why you've had people kind of, in my view, kind of foolishly speculate on, let's throw Ripple and Hedera into the strategic sort of crypto reserve. So hopefully, absurdities like that will fizzle away. But it's a sign of the lack of consensus, I would say, across the broader digital assets sort of industry.
Yeah, I think moving from sort of the executive branch to the legislative branch, I think there are sort of these three initiatives that seem to be the top contenders if there's going to be legislative movement on crypto that are the likely contenders. So one of them is the Bitcoin Act. And as we're talking now, the Senate is voting on making Senator Lummis the head of the digital asset subcommittee. We expect that to happen. And so I think it is safe to say, assuming that happens, we will see hearings on the SBR, which, if nothing else, I think can be very helpful for moving the Overton window on why Bitcoin is an important strategic asset for America geopolitically. Definitely anyone listening to this should read Matt's work on this topic. And, just to briefly echo, I think there's obviously a world of difference between having a sort of neutral digital commodity like Bitcoin as a reserve asset of the United States, analogous to why we might have historically held gold, and holding what it amounts to basically startup equity-like instruments, the country buying their bags. But I think broadly, it would send a very powerful signal for the Bitcoin Act to be passed. I think it would help monetize Bitcoin. It might, to some extent, demonetize gold, which could be useful for the United States geopolitical position, and definitely something that we're working a lot on. The other two potential bills have different constituencies. So the crypto industry writ large, like we talked about, their sort of biggest regulatory concern is, what assets are being sold as securities versus commodities. And that's something that would have to be sorted out in a market structure bill. So there's a lot of sort of political weight from specifically the large exchanges and VCs, and then specifically some of the large token foundations for tokens that the SEC has currently expressed a view constitute investment contracts. There's a lot of weight behind, a legislative fix in the form of a market structure bill. And then I'm also totally in favor of the third type of bill, which, as Matt mentioned, would be a stablecoin comprehensive legislation. I think there's a lot of energy there from Wall Street. I think it has not escaped folks' notice that Tether, the biggest stablecoin issuer, is per capita the most profitable company in the world. I think Wall Street wants to get in on the game. I think there is probably product market fit for stablecoins from already large trusted financial institutions, right? There are a lot of people out there that, with or without good reason, think that Tether, is a house of cards or whatever. This is sort of a favorite Wall Street FUD item for the crypto space. And I think the reason why we've not seen dollar tokens from sort of large banks or large asset managers is that there isn't enough regulatory clarity. And a comprehensive stablecoin bill, I think, would both give that clarity for big financial players to enter into the space, which would sort of start the process of really integrating the digital asset ecosystem with the traditional financial ecosystem. And I'd also expect that to be the first step on a road that leads to more tokenized real world assets. And it'll be fascinating to see how that plays out, whether that sort of accrues to the benefit of the crypto incumbents, right? There are lots of different blockchains where their sort of raison d'etre is they want to be a smart contract platform where tokenized real estate and stocks and bonds, et cetera, live and are traded, or whether, tokenization is, it allows for good UI, but people don't really care so much about sort of decentralized public blockchains. And if we get increasing sort of tokenization of real world asset legislation going forward, that just ends up being a sort of private technology that the large existing financial institutions use. But I think in the market, there is demand for things that are currently our securities laws don't allow. I think a lot of people would love to buy a token that represents $100 worth of real estate on the Upper West Side of Manhattan that, airdrops them dollar-denominated stablecoins every time rent is paid on a pro rata basis. That's really, really hard to do under the current securities laws. Do people care about if it's on a truly decentralized blockchain, or would they be happy to buy this product directly from BlackRock on a database that BlackRock owns? I think yet to be seen. But I think to the extent that we see a lot of energy around a stablecoin bill, I think that would speak to the relative power of the traditional financial incumbents as opposed to the native crypto industry, and interesting to see how that plays out emerging of the sort of concepts, the sort of primitives that come out of blockchain technology, but into sort of the financialization of everything on a more granular level.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that is I know I might be just deviating from the agenda, but like in my mind, like the SBR is extremely important, but it's kind of its own thing. I'd say structurally, you could see pretty quickly a combination of SAB 121 repeal and stablecoin legislation really having like a seismic shift on the interrelationship between the digital assets ecosystem and the traditional financial system globally. Obviously, based in the US, but with a global impact. And I think that is a little bit more technical, right, in a certain sense, but would be sort of the last major sort of structural shoe to drop that I think would fundamentally change the trajectory of the overall industry, right? Now you can have banks custody these assets, including these tokenized securities potentially, and then you have the regulatory environment where they can issue their own essentially dollar token. And they have franchises around the world. They have massive global distribution. They're already highly regulated financial institutions, and so just like the overall liquidity, the overall kind of infrastructure, like will just overnight have a massive expansion. And I think you're seeing like everyone essentially getting on side with that, right? And sort of preparing for the second and third order effects of when you have now major financial institutions that can custody these assets, can issue these tokens. You can hear in the remarks by Larry Fink at Davos, maybe practically salivating over the prospect of sort of tokenizing essentially all financial assets and creating digital rails that provide access to hold those assets, almost around the world, right? A kind of a sort of supercharged sort of equity system that rides on these digital rails. At the same time, that Bitcoin is sort of given at least the unofficial imprimatur of the U.S. government to serve as a neutral reserve asset around the world. So you have this, these major moves by the U.S. coming shortly on digital assets across the board that seem, essentially, look like a very expansionary mode, not just in the U.S. but around the world.
Amazing. I think the other thing of note here, as we're sort of transitioning from executive to legislative here, is, also the influence that Trump will have over the midterm elections, which, I know we just turned over Congress, but, I think that's generally on people's mind even now, is, trying to get on board with Trump's larger agenda. And so if they know that Trump is going to be, crypto friendly or Bitcoin friendly, I think that gives some legs to a lot of these legislative items that we've been talking about. So I guess the question here, and we can go to Zack first on this, is, to what extent does maybe the Bitcoin Act have legs, or even some of the other proposals that you've seen put forward? And does that have anything to do with Trump getting elected, or is this just sort of a larger shift that we saw from the election in November?
Oh, I think the odds of the Bitcoin Act passing went way up with Trump being elected. I don't know how much of that is because Trump will put his political weight behind it versus the sort of overall vibe shift, specifically, I mean, to some extent on a bipartisan basis, certainly within the Republican Party, folks looking at Trump for cues on how to look at Bitcoin and digital assets. And he's been openly positive about it. And what we've seen sort of at BPI is a strong interest, especially on the right, from people who want to be in lockstep, want to be pro Bitcoin, pro digital asset. They're not always 100% sure what that means, and sometimes they come to us for suggestions on the details of that. But they want to be supportive, and I think that is certainly helpful to the odds of the Bitcoin Act passing. And then on the left, I think there are a lot of folks who see the Biden administration's position towards Bitcoin and crypto as an unforced error. This is something that, like Van Jones has been talking about a lot recently. That the Biden administration was sort of writing off its constituents for whom this was an important issue, and between the various super PACs that were crypto backed that had not just an impact in the presidential election, but down the ticket in lots of congressional races, that made Trump's election, along with the election of various pro digital asset folks down ballot, I think really does change the conversation and the likelihood of something like the Bitcoin Act being passed. At this point, I think there are just too many variables to sort of be precise on what the odds are of a legislative SBR. I think the sort of relevant questions are, one, how much of a priority is crypto in DC? And then to the extent it is a priority enough to get some legislation through, which of these three bills between the stablecoin bill, the market structure bill, and the SBR is a priority? And there's definitely vigorous conversation within the digital asset industry about which of those is most important, led by the constituents for each of those bills. I wouldn't be surprised to see either the Bitcoin Act or something like the Bitcoin Act added as part of the reconciliation process, which is something that would happen sooner and wouldn't require the same filibuster-proof majority that you would need for a standalone legislative act. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Another thing to keep an eye on if you're assessing the viability of the Bitcoin Act is, are there going to be more co-sponsors announced, especially on a bipartisan basis? But I think there is, safe to say, there is both a lot of support from the industry behind the Bitcoin Act. I think it's a good Schelling point for our policy concerns in DC. And what we've seen so far is a real interest, even if not a hugely focused interest, by policymakers to be supportive of Bitcoin and to learn more. And I think these are all helpful ingredients.
Any thoughts, Matt?
No, I mean, I think to first order, right, the political impact of the digital assets industry is fundraising, right? I think they were activated really for the first time in 2024 and demonstrated their ability to elect candidates and knock off anti-crypto candidates, right? Like Sherrod Brown. And that politicians are not, sometimes they're maybe not the most, honorable people in the world, but they respond to incentives and they recognize reality. And that was accomplished, right, with crypto kind of, recovering from a bear market, right, wasn't really necessarily nearly as capitalized as it is now. So obviously heading into 2026, that fundraising machine is, it's only expectation for any politician is that they're going to confront an even stronger machine, right? And that's how our political system works. And so they're going to, try to figure out how they can, align themselves with this increasingly powerful and very vocal movement and industry, right? And that's right now, right? I mean, there are more speculative scenarios in 5-10 years where, if these trends continue, then sort of the Bitcoin voter, the crypto voter, could become like a major U.S. political constituency, right? Maybe it's 1 million or 2 million people now, who knows? And is like a barbell where there's a disproportionate number of those individuals that have outsized wealth that have not been politically active until very recently, right? So they're kind of a new cohort of individuals that have engaged now in politics. And I wouldn't say necessarily they're loyal to any particular party, right? I think they aligned with the Republican Party because they had been facing such hostility on the Democrats for the past 4 years, and certainly they'll probably be supportive of Trump's efforts in this current administration. But it's not like this has been a generational alignment, right? This was a kind of a historical contingency of folks that have a certain political objective and an existing set of politicians coming into party. So I think this sort of marriage is well defined for the next 2-4 years. But how this evolves and how the Democrats respond, right? Do they try to court back the voter, and how does that play out in these policy debates, right, around the Bitcoin Act, around these other policy proposals? It's gonna be very interesting to see. Are there parts of the Democratic coalition that like Richie Torres, like Ro Khanna, and others like them, that sort of carve out a very distinct niche for themselves? And how much opposition, how much power do they generate inside their coalition? Obviously, Senator Warren's still a very powerful senator, right? She's going to be the ranking member on the Senate Banking Committee, and she's not going to change her mind anytime soon. But could her opposition in many ways create dissension in the ranks and create opportunity for up and coming Democratic politicians to try to distinguish themselves and try to rebrand the Democratic Party for this industry? I think there's a lot of folks that are trying to do that right now. And the midterms will be, I think, a litmus test into how successful those efforts are. Obviously, Fair Shake is already raised. I don't know if it's close to 100 million already for 2026. I haven't seen the latest numbers, but there's a lot. And that will only become more of a significant force, I think, going forward.
Right. And even beyond, the fundraising element, there's also the sort of political promises that have been made.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, that's something that we're now really focused on, given, the fact that on Tuesday evening, Ross Ulbricht was pardoned. And that was, a big deal to the extent that Trump, made good on his promise to both the Bitcoin community and the libertarian community. And so I think, as we're sort of wrapping up here, um, what does that mean symbolically that Trump followed through on that? Did that sort of increase the likelihood that we see some of these proposals, get done? Whether that be an executive order SBR, sort of unrelated to the Bitcoin Act. What are some of the other maybe promises that Trump has made that maybe now have a better chance of getting through?
Zach, you want to take the significance?
Look, I think it's hard to say, but if you zoom out and so what does it mean symbolically that Trump issued an unconditional pardon for Ross Ulbricht? I mean, Ross Ulbricht is someone who got a extremely harsh sentence. I think 2 life sentences plus 40 years for starting the Silk Road website, which was used largely to buy and sell drugs. It was one of the sort of early dark web use cases that sort of married the technologies of Tor for anonymous internet browsing and communication with Bitcoin for anonymous payments. Worth noting, Bitcoin is somewhat less anonymous today than it was at the time the Silk Road was operative. Trump is not someone whose big issue is drug legalization or support of libertarian-minded, pushing the envelope on tech. So I think the takeaway here is this is a promise he made on the campaign trail to the libertarian and crypto constituencies. It's something that will probably cost some amount of political capital. It's definitely, uncontroversially within Trump's power to issue pardons to whoever he wants. I would note, especially given the way pardons were used by the outgoing administration. But I think this is not going to make sense to a bunch of ordinary Americans why Trump would free this person who has broadly a reputation as one of the most successful drug dealers of the 2010s. What I would take from that is that these groups that supported Trump are important to him, even now that he's elected. And so, just from like a Bayesian perspective, does that raise the odds that something like an SBR executive order would get through, or a different executive order that's helpful specifically to the crypto industry? Yes, I think that probably raises the odds somewhat. I think it's hard to be much more specific than that, though.
Yeah, I would say, well, one, like, it seems like the Bitcoin community was like itching for it on like 1201, right? All right. And so I think there's a sense in which it's funny, right? Like, I think there was a bit of dissonance or divergent opinion, right? Some Bitcoiners were very suspicious of Trump from the very beginning. This was all essentially just a traditional politician patronizing a constituency to get their money, to get their votes, and would essentially rug pull them the minute he gets in the office and he doesn't need them anymore, right? So there was, like, I think, a certain strain of cynical belief that Trump would effectively, and he even sort of like almost like winked at it during his Nashville speech, where he said basically, like, I don't have to listen to you after the election, right? Like, have fun with your Bitcoins, right? So there was kind of reason to be suspicious, right? To kind of be skeptical. Is Trump going to follow through on these campaign promises? He's made a lot of promises, right, in his life, right? Is just because somebody says something, especially a politician, doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen. So I think it was, we did learn new information, right? Like the fact that he did execute on that promise, like, has evidentiary value in terms of his ability and willingness to follow through on some of these other promises. And so that, to a certain extent, deflates some of the skepticism that folks might have had coming in to how much he's really going to follow through. But to Zach's point, it's all about political capital, right? It cost a little bit of political capital, yes, but it also was kind of, there'd be a huge number of individuals across, the industry that have supported Trump that would be very upset if he didn't pardon, or at least commute Ross Ulbricht's sentence. Would there be similar levels of anger and betrayal almost if he doesn't establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve by executive order? I don't know. I think a lot of people may feel that's a bit more of like a stretch goal, right? Like he said he would do a stockpile, right? So I think that's, an expectation that he will draw a box around those coins. So I think it would be a disappointment relative to expectations if he didn't do that. And so that probably is, kind of now like the median expectation now that he's pardoned Ross. But there's a lot of mechanics involved in that are different than the mechanics involved of pardoning Ross Ulbricht, right? There's got to be people at the Treasury that can like confirm that the language in the EO is like good, that there aren't going to be some squirrely things that the president's going to impose now mechanically on the U.S. Marshal Service, right? So, and a lot of those people just barely got into their offices, right? Like today or yesterday. And obviously the leadership hasn't even been confirmed by the Senate. So my only caution is just patience, right? In many ways for these things. There's a bureaucracy that's being staffed up. There's a lot of, thousands of other like pressing priorities at the president's desk. So I still have expectation that something like, a national stockpile will be established essentially by almost, verbal edict. And then it remains to be seen, right, how much the Overton window moves on these additional questions, right, for acquiring new Bitcoin. But I don't know, from my perspective, Bitcoin policy, it's like there's a matter of getting the momentum, capturing the momentum early is very important. But it's also, this is 4 years, right? And clearly the team that he's put in place is very pro-Bitcoin. Clearly, the orientation of the policy mandate is very pro-Bitcoin. And so the work is really on the industry and think tanks and advocacy groups to, make that real, right? To provide tangible recommendations, policy ideas that can help translate this high-level commander's intent into very specific actions throughout the administration, right? And it's not just the SBR, but it's what does this mean for national security or foreign policy, Department of State, Department of Defense, Department of, Director of National Intelligence, et cetera, all the way down across our approach to human rights and international aid and development. What are the folks, inside those bureaucracies? How can they, align with this high-level mandate? And then across, the maybe more non-traditional parts of the bureaucracy that can maybe raise their salience in the industry. But there's also things like the Tornado Cash cases, right? So the judiciary, I'm sure Zack could talk for another hour on that. I think you already probably have. Is where there's going to be a lot of work to be done, right? The judiciary is an independent branch of government, and there's a lot of cases that are quite challenging, and so it isn't just kind of this utopia, being inaugurated this past week. So I think a lot of work to be done. I think cautious optimism is in store, but politicians respond to pressure, and they need support, and they need ideas, right? And they need to be executed effectively inside these complicated bureaucracies where their attention is pulled in lots of directions constantly. So that's what BPI is for, hopefully.
All right, gentlemen, this was wonderful. Gonna go to both of you for final thoughts. We'll let Matt Pines catch his breath and go to Zack Shapiro first here.
Sure. I think it is easy to lose sight of how big a sea change there is likely to be in Bitcoin and digital asset policy from the previous administration to this administration. But it just is huge, right? So just to sort of tally up the stuff to pay attention to, one is just the end of the Biden administration's war on crypto. It's become a bit of a meme. That's something that David Sachs talked about at the crypto ball, but it's really true, right? The outgoing administration just was hostile to the interests of the Bitcoin community, and having that end is a really big difference. The head of every agency we've seen that's been nominated by Trump that touches on Bitcoin digital assets has been outwardly pro Bitcoin and digital assets, right? Not just neutral, but outwardly in favor and wanting to help. That's a huge shift. Trump, as seen by the pardon of Ross Ulbricht, seems like he is looking to do some political favors to the Bitcoin and crypto community. That's really important, and we'll see how that plays out. Crypto has arrived in a big way on Capitol Hill, and there are these three sort of landmark bills: the SBR, the Market Structure Bill, and the Stablecoin Bill that may or may not all pass. But there's a serious chance of them passing, and any one of those three would be a seismic shift in the regulatory environment and have really lasting change. On Capitol Hill, just through our work at BPI, we've seen lawmakers be really wanting to be helpful and supportive of the Bitcoin community. And, it might take a while to get them educated. That's really BPI's mission as a think tank, is to explain what Bitcoin is, why it's important, and what Bitcoin policy looks like. But relative to the previous administration and even months ago, there's just much more interest in taking us up on that offer for education and direction on Bitcoin policy. I think, like, broadly, this is just really good news as far as Bitcoin policy goes. Some of it will happen more quickly. Some of it will take a while to filter through. But there is this tendency, I think, looking at DC, to get lost, lose the forest for the trees, and focus on every new headline. And we've seen some of that already with the SBR executive order didn't happen on day one. The Ross pardon took more than a few hours. This stuff takes time, but I think if you zoom out, we're just in an incredibly different paradigm than we have been, and I'm just excited to see the way that plays out.
Yeah, I would say one of my larger observations is the international developments, right, that could be triggered by, but also are kind of revealed by this shift that Zack just pointed at. And you can kind of, both public and non-public, get a real sense of how this shift has manifested across the world in many different governments, their national leadership. And this correlates, right, to a kind of a broader political shift, especially in the West. So you can look at Canada, you can look at the other G7 countries, you can see this like political shift take place. And in many ways, like, Bitcoin is sort of aligned with some of those shifts taking place. So in Canada, right, Pierre Poilievre, he's very pro-Bitcoin. You have kind of the various opposition groups now in the UK, Reform, that sort of group is very pro-Bitcoin. But also just non-Western ideological groups, right? You have like many Gulf kingdoms that are paying very close attention to the U.S.'s pro-Bitcoin shift and are trying to assess the pace and magnitude of that change, and they've in many respects already moved pretty far in a pro-Bitcoin direction, not just mining Bitcoin, but even holding those assets, at least in their personal accounts as leaders and sovereign wealth funds. And there's also like interesting murmurs coming out of China, right? That China could be reassessing their stance towards Bitcoin. Obviously, they have a huge Bitcoin industry that they kicked out. A lot of those companies were essentially formed as subsidiaries of state-owned enterprises, started doing operations in Africa. But the Chinese economy is not doing so great. Maybe they want some hard capital, but if they regulate it, they control it, they can help soak up some of their excess solar and hydro production. And that, and they've also been, they approved Bitcoin ETFs in Hong Kong that are in kind, that have some limited gated sort of mainland access. So it's important to recognize Bitcoin is a global network. It's a global phenomenon. U.S., is sort of pivoting quite dramatically from a previous administration. But this is a global dynamic, right? Lots of other countries are now reassessing their role and major pools of capital as well, right? Like Larry Fink at Davos, and I saw the chairman of the CEO of UBS kind of like almost like begrudgingly acknowledge now, right? Like this is now a thing, and the knock-on effects of that are hard to fully assess in advance. But we could be just at the very early stages of that process of kind of a re-rating of the political salience, the political power of Bitcoin and Bitcoiners. And there are national leaders that respond to incentives across the government, even in non-traditional democracies. And so I wouldn't. It's hard for me to underestimate at this point what 4 years of a pro-Trump, a pro-Bitcoin Trump administration means for Bitcoin globally, right? That I think is a very significant development that's hard to fully calibrate right now, but I think it's going to be a matter of increasing importance.
Amazing. Thank you both. This was great.